So ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to today's Primary Innovation webinar. To introduce today's speaker, I'll now pass over to James Turner.
Thank you very much, John. This is me stepping into Denise's shoes so that she can enjoy just listening and participating rather than also having to introduce the webinar. So I now get the privilege of introducing the Primary Innovation webinars, and I'd like to say thank you very much to Jeff Coutts for kindly stepping into the breach and preparing a webinar on the 9 Principles survey that he and Tony undertook, along with input from many of you that are online in terms of providing feedback on those 9 Principles questions. So this is an opportunity for Jeff to share some initial findings from that survey that started to shape up from the right shop a few weeks ago, and very keen to get discussion going about some of the emerging findings, because that can feed nicely back into the paper that a number are preparing from the 9 Principles survey. So I'll hand it now over to Jeff. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks James, and thanks John, and thanks to those brave people who have found time in their day to directly listen, and hello to all those who may in the future look at this online. Yeah, I feel pretty fortunate being able to talk about the 9 principles. I mean, after all, my role in this project is a lot more in that little step back and looking at the whole evaluation side. And yet these 9 principles are kind of like the core, if you like, or at least we're thinking that maybe that they're the core of the co-innovation approach. And so I've been able to step in that, with the help of others to, in a sense, it's not so much evaluation per se, it's more of developing that sort of deeper understanding of what's really going on and how does it relate to theory around co-innovation. So thanks to Niels and Paula and Tony and Denise and James and Nicola and Kelly and others who have all contributed data into this process. Righto. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in standing there as an evaluator in this project over time is that initially, particularly initially, there was a whole lot of angst about what is co-innovation and how is it different to all the theory you've been caught up with before and the different approaches that we have. And, those of us who have been in the social research and extension game for the last 20, 30 years, we've gone through a lot of different cycles. We've gone through action research and participative action research and action learning and adaptive learning. I did my master's in the 80s on knowledge and information systems. We had a big push for a while there from Lancaster University with Checkland on soft systems methodology. We've got others here who are saying that, look, what we're talking about is just good practice. And it sort of, brought me into this, we got this lovely poem in Australia by C.J. Dennis that sort of misquotes this particular thing of Shakespeare, but, what's in a name? And then he sighs and clasps his little hands and rolls his eyes. Be it Julia or Juliet, he loves her yet. A rose by any other name would smell the same. So a question here is, when we're starting to look at co-innovation and its role in RD&E and the innovation system, is it really anything different to what's gone on before? And part of this survey was to try to get a better understanding of what was going on, how things that were being applied, and what we are learning about co-innovation in terms of its pillars. Co-innovation, comes out of the what they now talk about with the agricultural innovation systems. And I feel like I'm not really the right person to really go on about this, but let me anyway. And look at the kind of words that they're talking about here. I might add that, again, when I did my master's back in the 80s, it was the agricultural information system. And now innovation is really interesting because what it sort of is implying by the words is it's something that's proactive, that's active, that's moving, that's changing, that's evolving, that's creating, rather than just passing information around. And I think that's why the whole innovation word has really sort of caught on as something in the area that we're working on. But in this innovation systems approach, they really promote this being a result of a process of networking, interactive learning, this notion of lots of different sort of people from different places, so that you're not just getting the same view reinforced. And, maybe, even outside of our traditional agricultural area. So now you'll notice that we started with Shakespeare and C.J. Dennis, and I'm keeping up, if you like, this actor and stage thing. Not that I think we're really all just playing a part, but it's this issue of providing a space for creativity, a space for learning with many different actors. So forgive the sort of puns that come through in pictures on this. Now, these 9 principles. Okay, so one of the big issues at the start was, all right, we're going to do co-innovation. What's co-innovation? And part of going through that process, maybe I'll just jump to the next slide first, is that a number of people in the project, some of you, started to look through the literature to have a look at what are the principles, what are the pillars of innovation. And so, there were these particular authors, and those of you who don't know where those authors are, they can certainly contact one of us after this webinar and chase up the actual reference. But there was nothing quite met the both the if you like, the participative approaches and the structural type things that that they were looking for to guide this project. So they drew from these particular authors and came up with these particular 9 principles that were shaped towards guiding this particular project, but strongly based in the literature. So the issue then was, will these principles provide guidance, and also will they provide the space in which co-innovation operates? And so this slide shows the issue of this space, the co-innovation space, providing this opportunity to innovate in a way that the space wasn't quite as available before. And so around this space then, we've got these 9 principles that provide this, well, it's not a boundary, because never let us talk about boundaries when it comes to co-innovation, but it just provides this space. So let's look at them just quickly one at a time. And there is a lot more written of these, and a number of you who are on here already know these quite well. But first of all, this big issue of not jumping straight into something, taking time to scope the problem. And taking that time has been something that's really been found in this whole project. That when you really are trying to involve a whole number of different players and you're trying to take a step back and look at the problem, it does take time. And then the question, which we'll see as we go later further into this, is it really worth the effort to take that time and step back, involve a whole lot of people and try to scope the problem rather than just jumping straight into the answers? The next thing, and certainly you'll notice that these are quite related. So being inclusive, I mean, by definition, if you're really scoping the problem well, you're including all these different network people that may have been left out of the loop otherwise. But number 2 says, well, don't just involve them in this immediate scoping, but be inclusive as you go through the project. Keep them in the loop. Keep people informed. And of course, number 3, engage and value, is, you might think that's part of the first one, but you can be inclusive in one way, but to actually actively engage people and provide forums and opportunities for engagement and demonstrate that their input is valued and listened to and is being informed, that's when it gets kind of really quite exciting, I guess. And then as part of that, of course, it's learning from each other. So it's an active commitment to joint learning, not just listening, thank you for what you've said, I will consider it and see what's appropriate, but this two-way learning. And in a lot of this literature that we've had in the past, we've talked about single loop learning and double loop learning and triple loop learning, and I'm sure there's quadruple loop learning. But this notion that this is a very active process, it's not just some theoretical principle, but about engaging and valuing and learning. And part of that, and it's by that engaging and valuing and learning from each other and inclusivity, that there's a chance to develop some kind of a shared vision. And this whole thing, though, is not getting to this narrow end result quick enough, but it's keeping this shared vision. I believe, you know, there is a biblical quote that says, you know, without a vision, the people perish. Maybe won't go quite that far, but the notion is that if people keep looking in the same direction, then there's a chance that we'll work together towards achieving it. The next one, you think, well, gee, why do you even need to say this? Of course we're honest and open and constructive. But I guess we've all been in projects where people are sort of stuck to their particular point of view and they've been quite critical of others, and you know, this goes back to this willingness to learn from each other and valuing, etc. So actively working out approaches and ways and structures to keep that openness and transparency and constructiveness in the system, again, they seem to be quite critical if we're really going to innovate rather than just go ahead with business as usual. Being aware of the wider context, you know, let's just keep this thing going. The interesting one for me is the 8, be flexible and adaptable. Now, when I first saw these principles, I thought, hang on, I thought that the real principle behind this, the one thing that really stood out for me in the whole co-innovation approach that I was seeing in New Zealand was this thing of reflexive learning, this having actual people whose role was to facilitate reflection, capturing that reflection, learning from it. And I was thinking, well, where are they in the principles? And then I looked at Principle 8 and I said, that's where it is. And if you're going to be flexible and adaptable, it means that you have this process of picking up on the learning that's happening, engaging these alternative views and being able to then build them into the program. So the reflexive and the reflexive learning and the reflexive monitors or whatever, they fit firmly in 8, as well as, of course, being involved in the rest. 9 was an interesting one. 9 sort of says, look, sometimes this can all seem to be a bit too hard, it's not kind of working, it's not kind of floating, but hang in there. Just keep working on that inclusivity, keep working on that engagement and value, keep working on sort of, you know, talking about the shared visit. When it's not working, be honest about it, but constructive, etc. So that sticking with the process I thought was a really interesting one. So, you know, we look at these 9 principles and they seem really good, and you think, well, how did they actually work in practice? Did they actually help the process? Are they too wishy-washy? Are they too whatever? So what can we learn about them? Gee, John, I hope I've got a stop in here. Yeah, pretty soon, haven't I? Righto. We've talked about where they came from, and now we're going to pause. And I'm just interested to see how much background people do have in those earlier approaches I talked about over the years. Things like, you know, the action learning, action research, knowledge systems, soft systems. So, so I have to, I think, pass my screen over to John at this stage.
No, in actual fact, the magic thing, so
Yes.
a poll is appearing magically in front of everyone. So the question is, what is your level of experience in these general approaches? And
Great.
people can see there's 4 radio buttons there to select, and I can see about half the people have voted. So come on, folks, it's not hard. We'll close it off in 3, 2, 1. And I'll just share those results so everyone can see them. So it's a bit of a bell curve, I guess, there, Jeff. So a few people have said low, and slightly more have said high, and a huge number have said moderate. So at 63% have said that their level of experience in those general approaches is moderate. So that's the first poll. Now there's another one next, isn't there? So I'll just flip over to that. So we're curious to hear, what was your prior level of understanding of co-innovation?
This is before this seminar.
That's right, yes. So do you mean at the beginning of the project, Jeff, or at the beginning of today's webinar?
No, I actually mean beginning of today's webinar, just where are they up to with their understanding of co-innovation.
Lovely. And just as people are voting there, Jeff, did you actually see, on your screen, did you see the results of the previous poll?
No, I didn't.
No, and that's why I do read them out each time. So I can now see most people have finished, so I'll close that and I'll share it. So for this one, what was your prior level of understanding in co-innovation for today's webinar? So again, it's a bit of a skewed bell curve. So 11% said none, 22% said low, a whopping 44% said moderate, and 22% have said high. So
let's hope that 22% were the project team and they weren't down the other end.
That's right. So there's one more to go now, isn't there, Jeff? So this one is, how much do you think the principles help with applying co-innovation? So not at all, to some degree, to a moderate degree, or to a large degree. I can see everyone's getting in really quick this time. That's great. Of course, folks, this is where it's good if you're sitting in front of your own computer instead of at Rurakura in the little conference room there, because I can see one person is voting on behalf of everyone else. But here we go. So I can see most people have voted. So here we go. Here's those results. You'll be pleased, Jeff, to see that no one has said not at all. 11% have said to some degree, and then it's 44% for both, to a moderate degree and a large degree. So in other words, almost 90% are saying moderate or large degree.
All right, well, look, thank you for that. But, gee, you know, what this, judging on those responses, there could be a whole interesting webinar sometime just on those processes of action learning and whatever for those who sort of missed out on some of that background, because it might explain a lot of the kind of use of terminology and some of the history of where all this comes from. So, gee, there's a topic just waiting to be had. In terms of those principles, yeah, to me it was this question of, look, they all sound very good. Sometimes you think they almost sound all too good. So what does it actually mean in practice? And what did it actually mean when you were really trying to apply those principles, particularly if you tried to apply them after a project that already started? And how does that start helping us understand and explain what co-innovation is? And that was kind of the motivation behind the survey that we did. So really, the overarching question was, well, how useful were these theoretical principles? You know, are they just motherhood statements? Are they something with grunt in implementing and guiding co-innovation? And again, we keep up with that nice Shakespearean theatre theme. What we've done here, and be aware of this because this is a boundary to this particular research, we've limited it to the actual on-the-ground innovation projects, those that are actually working with researchers, with growers, with extension-type people, with social researchers or whatever, to make a difference on the ground. Now, at the higher project level and at the researcher level and the community of practice at a more national level, they also went through this process, and there's a whole lot of different lessons, I think, or hopefully overlapping lessons from there. But so just realise the boundaries here. We've limited it to the results from the survey itself, and we've limited it to the on-the-ground projects that have been operating for a while. So there was a Maori agribusiness project, for example, that only just started, that also, responded to this. But we'll just give it. We focused on those that had been operating for a while. So there's a little bit of a range here, and it was really meant to have a look at, did this make a difference where it hit the ground? And of course, part two, of course, will be, did it make a difference when it hit national policy and management type people as well? So they're the 5 projects. Now, so the survey was a pretty simple little survey. And the idea was that project teams work together to talk about their particular context and answer as a project team rather than a whole lot of individuals per se. So here's the 9 principles. Go through each one of them for us, which was a big ask, but it was so nice that they actually did it, and thanks to Tony for facilitating it. How have they actually applied this principle? Was it something that was easy to apply? What problems did they face? How did they overcome these? How did the principle impact on the outcomes? And in the end, after thinking about it, thinking how they applied it, looking at the benefits of it, how important did they actually think this principle really was to be able to help produce better outcomes? And we thought, well, who better to ask than people on the ground who were grappling with real everyday problems? So that's, again, the boundary of the survey. Now, when I first started doing this, playing this webinar, I was going to go through each of the 9 principles and how people answered that, and I realised that I didn't have the 2 hours necessary. So what I've tried to do here is try to pull together some findings overall from a lot of those overlapping principles to see, in a sense, what we were finding. as James said at the start, it's kind of a preliminary look because, you know, we're now trying to go back into the raw data to sort of tease things out a little bit more. But you're getting the first cut here, and hopefully there'll be some insights in the first cut and it will help us looking at the next cut. So, as you might imagine, by looking at the principles, they certainly emerge as being very interrelated, and there was an underlying consistency. You know, you look across that whole, if you said, what are all these principles about? It's about inclusion, openness, and flexibility. Maybe it's about respect as well. But they were the kind of underpinning things of this kind of approach. And then the question is that business as usual? Is that how we always do things? Or we tend to not be as inclusive, not be as open, not be as flexible, and we just go down a particular path because that's what we're being paid to do, and that's what our discipline tells us is what we do. It has been said that if you're a carpenter, the problem always is, you know, grab a hammer or something. Anyway, and we had some discussion about, you know, merging some of those principles, and I thought, yeah, that was a great idea. But, you know, after going through them time and time again, I was a bit worried that if we took this particular thing out, like took out the openness and constructiveness, that you can't just assume that as you learn with people that that's something that's taken into account. And I think each of these are more than just an idea in the back of your mind, although it's certainly there. But there are processes that you can use to help with openness and constructiveness. Yes, there are processes you can use in scoping and involving people. There are scopers, things that you can use. So by taking out, and I really saw it as facets of the diamond, and I didn't have a diamond in any of my Shakespearean photos, so I had to use the skull, and I thought it kind of fit, you know, where would we be without each of our structures in our skull? Now, and each of those principles were rated highly important by most of the projects that we looked at. So this, you know, I know it looks like a busy graph, but just bear with me here. This is just a summary of the ratings. We've got people to rate on a 0 to 10 scale about how important, on reflection and after trying to use this principle, how important did they see that principle towards really achieving good outcomes. And you can see on that graph it's the blue one, and they go down the 9 principles. So, you know, they're all pretty high, aren't they? They're all around, what's the lowest? Yeah, I hope you're looking too. I can find 8.5. I mean, some individual projects put some a little bit lower than that because these are averages across those projects. But on the whole, all those principles that we've talked about were seen as really important, which also shows the commitment of the project team to that kind of approach. It's interesting then to have a look at how difficult it was to actually implement those in projects. And, you know, that this kind of also shows, I guess, some of the difference between theory and practice. So, you know, everyone says it's really great to get the different views of the problem. Yeah, it's a really 9 out of 10 type thing. But, you know, we tried to apply, we did pretty well, but it wasn't like, it wasn't a shoe-in. And the same when we got down to shared vision. Now, people still thought that was pretty important, but felt it was, you know, some of the projects felt that was pretty hard to get. And to some extent, and as we'll see, context was a big player in that. So where you actually came into a project after it started, and it had a very definite agenda and an outcome that it was being paid and contracted to achieve, then it was difficult to go beyond that. So there were some context issues around applying that particular vision as well. But in the end, you know, it's quite comfortable that those projects and those principles were underpinning the thinking and the practice of these projects. And this is the whole point of learning from them, so that we could inform both theory but other people trying to apply the principles. Hopefully you've had a good look at that. All right, so context, as I mentioned, did really affect how well people could apply those principles, and maybe even how important that they were to the ultimate outcome. So, for example, the projects went across different types of problems. So some of the projects were very extension-oriented. Ones that were out there working with farmers, looking at how they could achieve better, you know, production or environmental benefits. One or two were a lot more research focused, where it was trying to really get to the science behind particular problems that were being faced in industry. And another one was very broadly across the value chain in the timber area. So each of those affected who needed to be or could easily be brought into the problem, and where the boundaries of that scoping might sit, where there were really strong outcomes and processes and activities already built in. It was a lot harder to be flexible and to get anything beyond the kind of vision that was there originally. And where there was a value chain issue, well, certainly, the challenge in being able to get people together and get people talking were really not as easy as otherwise. And, linked to that, of course, was the stage of project. So if a project had already started, as I've already mentioned, it was difficult to apply some of these things that you might have if you had had the luxury of working that through to start. And also problem development, and I wish I knew what I meant by that word, and I'm sure someone could tell me, but was it a really clear problem, or was it a more diffuse problem that people had to come to grips with? So where it was a very definite problem, like we need to fix this particular thing, it was more difficult, or maybe there was less need to apply some of these principles in the same way than if you approached a really wicked problem that no one quite knew the answer to, and so were quite open to a whole lot of different views. And we also found that things like in the dairy industry, or the dairy project, milk prices caused a problem. They were a problem, which meant that people were diverted in their support for the milk industry or the dairy industry, and so some of the processes that they would have liked to have used in these particular innovation projects had to be put on hold for a little while. So those kind of things can go onto it. The issues. One of the big issues was that if you really tried to implement this, as we all know, getting in more stakeholders involved and getting engaged and really listening to them and acting on it and developing shared vision and all that, it does slow the process down, certainly initially, until you really have really neat processes in place and everyone knows where they are and whatever. So that was an issue, and of course there was an interesting study being done on one of these projects about when you compare slowing the process down to the benefit of the approach that was used, what was the net gain, what was the net loss. But that's not for this webinar as such. And there are other ones where even though people were willing to come to meetings or be involved, some of them came with very strong agendas and very strong points of view and weren't easily swayed. So just because you had a view of being constructive and open and caring and sharing and learning, it didn't mean that the other stakeholders you involved had that same viewpoint or agenda or perspective on the issue. So, there's a lot of that kind of team building or understanding that really needs to go there, and skills of working with stakeholders in conflict. Now, as we pointed out, flexibility is part of that, and inclusion was really difficult to include where projects already commenced with tight work plans, outputs and pipelines. And so, you've almost got to sort of step back and say, well, where is there scope to add a little bit of this to try to add, try to improve the outcomes, even if we can't go the whole way. Adapting the principles. Well, so in one of the projects, the timber project that had a large value chain that they were dealing with, it was almost impossible to get everyone together at any one time. So for example, they worked on these clusters where different groupings of people or different stakeholders got together at different times at different places. And so you kept a link between them rather than expecting all people to come together in, for example, a common steering group or a working group or whatever. And that was, I think also with them it was how often they got together started to prove a little bit of a problem. And so there was, agreement to meet less often. So there was that flexibility that brought in, even with the way in which people were engaged. In the dairy industry, for example, they really wanted to, at that stage, bring in viewpoints from the different groups of growers and, who were involved in the heifer rearing issue. And so they used focus groups going around and trying to do that quite concentrated rather than getting people involved necessarily at that level in a more protracted way. And really got a change in the way they were thinking there. And another group who really didn't find a whole lot of interest in this, having forums around this, decided just that they would go ahead anyway, and then put it there, and then just see, whether people started to come along on the journey. And in that case, they certainly did. Having people listen to others. So it was a little bit difficult to get that common understanding and common working between different groups in one particular project. So what they did was they went and listened to what the different projects said. They used that information to develop a draft strategy, then took it back to the different groups and said, well, this is what we've got from all the groups, now how would you like to do it? So a little bit of an iterative process rather than this common group all agreeing on something as such, which was actually quite an adaptation of that particular approach. And also certainly modelling the behaviour with people. So, not everyone comes in with the same understanding about how to learn from each other. If you model it, when people model it in the project, then they got some, response back on that. Developing the shared vision, the goal and approach. So some people there, and I know a lot of projects in the past have used management groups, and but within using those kind of management groups to keep linking back to as the project developed, but also reporting in line with that shared vision, so that everything wasn't just, oh, we've done this milestone, isn't problem, all that. You continually sort of refer back to the vision that you're aiming for as you react to these kind of groups and consultative groups and management groups. And so I know one project, talked about having to continually sort of give feedback to stakeholders, and it really took time then to get this emerging vision until that win-win was evident. So it wasn't just sitting in a room and coming up with a common vision, but continually feeding back what was happening, what the groups were saying, what was doing, and developing this win-win as part of the emerging vision. The achieving full honesty and openness was really about building trust, that people need to have trust, taking the time through the meetings to develop that trust, bringing agendas out into the open in a constructive way, having the skills to be able to do that. And that was, so not having agendas hidden in the background, but again, the constructive way, and that was being brought out. And this sticking with the project process. So, look, if the meeting fatigue is a problem, have less, one project had less meetings. If people didn't understand the language, change the language and modify the methods into terminology that they could understand, so they didn't feel like, what is this crazy words being talked about. Really continually harking back to that shared vision and developing it. And also, even when things are going a bit rough, one of the groups was saying, well, look, we knew we weren't going to get far in this project because it was already so set. But by what we're doing with the networking and developing and the conversations that are being established, is that it's really an investment in the future as we look to do more projects in this area and with these groups of people, so that there's a long-term view of it as well. And it's already 1:45 and I'm just about finished. The benefits of application, well, certainly the projects have reported that there has been very definite stakeholder buy-in by their involvement and by the way they're being interacted with. So they actually had some interest in the results, in it working and being able to contribute. There were some specific examples of changes in focus towards better outcomes. So in the one working with irrigation, which was very much focused on water application to start with, the process ended up having a lot stronger sort of emphasis on the soil condition as well, and how all that whole system interacted. The heifer rearing project initially was all about, getting the contracts right between dairy farmers and people who raised heifers, and then came to a realisation it wasn't about what was written down, but actually relationships and how the sort of whole working relationship worked between them. And that changed kind of a focus on the approach. Another one into the timber industry, decided to get a lot stronger customer focus in terms of what they were producing rather than what was working more at the farm level or at the intermediate level. And another project talked about how the flexibility and the reflection allowed them to sort of stop doing some things and make better use of resources, so more cost effective and more cost efficient. So they're just little glimmers of the kind of benefits that could be expected, and they're what we have to keep following up and look for, and certainly look for at the national level as well. this is quite a journey here. So is co-innovation worth the effort? It does take the time and resources. It is difficult to overlay once the project has already started. But there's no doubt that it does foster conversations, it does challenge, it does sort of encourage sharing and this interest. It raises stakeholder interest and buy-in, and you know, there are already indications where there have been quite specific payoffs. Now, all of us are starting on the journey. It's a matter of how do we sort of learn from what we've been doing so far and really embed those things that really do make a difference. Final insights. Problem complexity and boundaries influence the degree and type of application of the principles, which we've talked about. And principles are fine, but people do need tools and they do need skills to be able to actually actively, in a practical sense, apply some of those principles. And I think that's something that's already been worked on. There's a great book on how reflexive monitors can work, for example, and there are other tools. And it's not just throwing people a list of principles, but here are the principles, and hey, here are some kind of ways of applying them and guiding you into using them. And really, that's what I've just said, really. So given that we're just about towards the end of our talk, just a couple of quick questions, I think, John, to finish off with. Do you have these on your magic sheet as well?
No, I don't. People can hopefully just see them on your screen.
Okay. All right. So what do you think? For those of you who are aware of all those different approaches, or even those of you who just know about good practice, do you think co-innovation is something new, or is it arose by any other name? If you think it is something a little bit new that offers something new, raise your hand, and I can't really see them, but John will tell me. So if you think it actually offers something new into the whole mix, based on what we've talked about today, what do you think?
That's a good question there, Jeff, and I can see of our audience of 11 people who are able to raise their hand, 3 have raised their hand, 4 have raised their hands.
Do we have another?
5, yes, we have 5.
All right,
so
course, about half.
Oh, we have 6.
All right, so we have about half who are thinking that there really is something new, and we have the other half who are yet convinced. And I think this journey towards the end of the project is to really pull together those things that are feeding back into theory and practice to say, you know, is this really something new? And if it is, how do we actually do it to get better outcomes? The other thing is a lot of questions are about whether these 9 principles are a recipe or a guide. If you think they work as a recipe, could you raise your hands? You know, just here they are. Implement these and Bob's your uncle. It's a recipe, nicely laid out clearly, like making a cake. So if you think it's a recipe as opposed to a guide, raise your hands.
Great. So of the 11 people who are able to raise their hands, because panelists and presenters aren't able to raise their hands, Jeff, 0 people have raised their hands.
All right. So they really do hopefully see it as a guide. Anyway, look, that's the end of my time. That's the end of the, really interested to get any feedback via email and comment to really assist us as we go forward in finishing this first paper and then develop sort of further work on it. So that's it for me.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. I think we can maybe just go another 5 minutes longer for those who are able to stay. Jeff, can you flip back to your 4th slide, which is that one that shows the 9 principles, please? Because we have a few questions and comments. That one there, yes, beautiful. Okay, so just a few comments from the audience. Firstly, just a little typo, number 5, site would actually be S-I-G-H-T, Eagle Eyes. Denise picked that up for us. But Denise,
very nice, thank you.
That's right. She also makes the comment that we seem to have moved a long way from the Nedeloff's principles, and that she's rereading them, and we've made them ours, she says.
Oh, great comment.
That's good. Now, Graham's asking, do you think co-innovation is significantly different in the AIS / primary sector?
It's a good question, and I think it's one that we really we need to look at. I really think that this whole notion of innovation systems really has developed in that space anyway. I think James can probably do a lot better job at answering that, and it's one to throw back to him and his team, I think.
Yeah, sure. And we are looking at doing a webinar in a few months' time with James where he can tease out some of the deeper principles of the co-innovation approach too. So Jeff, could you comment on the relationship of co-innovation with the other approaches that you mentioned? Is it an either or can we, the approaches be mixed when and where appropriate?
Yeah, well, I think there are elements of a lot of the early approaches in this. And I think some of them actually provide some guidance into how we actually use these principles. I mean, for example, with the whole action research side of things, there was a very strong emphasis on reflection that wasn't very often done in practice. What I like about the co-innovation approach, particularly as it's used in New Zealand, is that you've actually pulled that reflection out. You've got reflexive monitors and you've built it in so that it can't be lost, whereas it often was lost in the earlier times. The information, the agricultural information and knowledge systems type approach really focused a lot more on just information sharing rather than sort of really proactive process for innovation. So I think there's certainly overlaps, and I think that there are learnings from it. But hopefully what they're doing is this co-innovation stuff is being developed, is pulling out the eyes of what we've learned and tried in the past and tried to capture that in a way which really helps us move forward. So I just think it's a natural progression, and it's really important that we learn and we get it as right as we can.
That's good. Again, just with your 9 principles slide there, suggestions being made that it'd be good to put these maybe in some three-dimensional way, showing some interrelationships, and a comment that with co-innovation emphasis on action, could Principle 4 be adapted to include learning from each other in real-world experimentation?
Yeah, great. I mean, I've just made these very short headings compared to how they're further, I mean, that they're expressed in the literature and in the documents for this project. So yes, I mean that's certainly encapsulated in number 4.
Yeah, that's good. And finally, just a few comments that people see this as definitely a guide, with some practical bits in them, which is great. And in some ways, a lot of it is common sense, but the challenge is being deliberate about it. Would you agree with that, Jeff?
Absolutely. I think it's that deliberate, and my other point, that I made at the end about, you can't just tell people scope the problem without giving them some kind of a framework or tools to be able to do that. You can't say, be honest, open, and constructive without saying, look, here are some processes that help transparency and for people to be constructive. Here's how you deal with, So I think that underpinning all of these principles are some skills and tools and frameworks that allow you to apply it in your particular situation.
Yeah, sure. And finally, just a comment about, I think that first one about the problem development, it means coming in at the start, so actually starting working together with defining the problem, so involving people from step 1. Would you agree with that, Jeff?
Certainly ideal. But the problem is, if we get to a project and get involved in it and it's already quite well developed and on the way, do we give up on these principles? Or do we then say, as one of the projects has said, well, given the constraints, how can we start to bring in a flavour of this and maybe impact on the outcome?
Yes, so point 8, being flexible and adaptable. Okay, so on that point, I think we need to wrap it up. So I might pass over to James if you'd like to make some concluding comments. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, John, and thank you very much, Jeff, for putting together the presentation. It's a great outcome from, I think, the idea was sparked at the M&E workshop that we had in July, and you and Tony put it into place with getting that survey out and Tony working with the groups. And it's been a great way to see, as Denise pointed out, how we've made these principles our own, both in terms of adapting them to the New Zealand context and also how we apply them in different ways in the different projects. So it's great that we're New Zealandizing the concept of co-innovation to fit with the context that we work with in the New Zealand primary sector. So obviously in a month's time we'll have another webinar, and I think it's around sharing some insights from a specific innovation project. Kiko will let everybody know when that is and what the topic will be. Thank you everybody for joining in and for participating. And thank you very much, John, again for all your help with running and supporting these webinars. Thanks a lot.